The frost lay thick upon the hedgerows of St. Mary Mead, glinting faintly in the pale December sunlight. The world seemed suspended in a hush of icy stillness, the air crisp and faintly perfumed with chimney smoke. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped snugly in her grey wool coat and a soft pink scarf knitted by her own hand, stood waiting by the village green where the Frost coach, a cheerful motor coach that ran winter excursions across the countryside, was preparing for its day's journey. It was, as the driver had said proudly, the safest and warmest way to see the winter landscape without freezing your nose off. Today's route was to Windermere Lodge, a manor newly reopened after a long period of neglect, where the owner, Colonel George Halworth, had invited several guests for a winter luncheon. Miss Marple had been persuaded to join by her dear friend, Mrs. Dolly Bantry, who had declared that a change of scene and a bit of gossip would do wonders for her circulation. Miss Marple, who never declined a chance to observe human nature in its various forms, agreed politely, though her true interest lay more in watching people than in enjoying landscapes. There were 8 passengers altogether, Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry took the seats nearest the window, while opposite them sat a sharp, featured woman in her 50s, wrapped in furs and gazing out with thin, lipped disdain. This was Mrs. Constance Deering, widow of a late industrial magnate. She was known to be wealthy, sharp-tongued, and rumoured to have a fondness for young men of questionable virtue. Next to her sat Mr. Lionel Grant, a jovial, red-faced solicitor from Much Benham, who seemed determined to fill the coach with conversation. "Can't beat a frosty morning, eh? Clears the head. I say, did you hear the news about Sir Percival's jewels? Nasty business," he said to anyone within earshot. Behind Miss Marple were 2 younger passengers, Mr. Dennis Halworth, nephew to the Colonel, a charming yet restless young man with the careless ease of someone who had never known responsibility, and Miss Clara Elwood, a shy, well-dressed girl who seemed to blush whenever Dennis so much as glanced her way. At the very back, silent and somewhat apart, sat Mr. Edwin Fawcett, a thin, pale man with spectacles and a book clutched close. He had the air of a clerk or schoolteacher, and barely looked up during the journey. As the coach rattled along the frozen road, conversation mingled with the hum of the engine. Mrs. Deering and Mr. Grant argued amiably about property taxes, while Mrs. Bantry whispered delightedly to Miss Marple about how Colonel Halworth's late wife had been something of a tyrant, poor man. Miss Marple smiled faintly, knitting needles clicking softly in her lap. She noticed small things, how Mrs. Deering's gloved hand trembled slightly when the Colonel's name was mentioned, how young Dennis's eyes darted nervously when money or inheritance came into the conversation. Such details were always more telling than words. The journey took an odd turn near the village of Little Wendover. The coach slowed unexpectedly, and the driver, Mr. Barnes, muttered something about engine trouble. While he checked beneath the bonnet, the passengers stretched their legs by the roadside. Frost sparkled like crushed diamonds upon the grass. It was then that Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Deering step aside to speak sharply to young Dennis, her face tight with anger. The conversation was brief but intense. Miss Marple caught only a few words. "You'll regret it," Mrs. Deering hissed before turning away. Dennis looked pale, but when he saw Miss Marple watching, he smiled quickly, pretending nothing was amiss. By the time they reached Windermere Lodge, snow had begun to fall in slow, delicate flakes. The manor, a grand grey building set amid tall pines, looked as though it had been plucked from a Christmas card. Colonel Halworth greeted them heartily at the door, his moustache bristling, his voice booming with forced cheer. "Welcome, my friends. Come in, come in. There's a fire roaring and sherry waiting. the guests entered gratefully, stamping snow from their boots. Inside, the drawing-room was warm and inviting, filled with the scent of pine, orange peel, and polished wood. A great fire crackled in the hearth, and silver trays gleamed upon the sideboard. As the group mingled, Miss Marple found herself quietly observing the dynamics. Mrs. Deering seemed strangely tense, glancing toward the Colonel more often than courtesy required. Mr. Grant drank heartily and spoke too loudly. Miss Elwood avoided Dennis's gaze, though her eyes betrayed anxiety. It was during luncheon, however, that the atmosphere shifted. The soup had just been served when Mrs. Deering, midway through a remark about the folly of trusting certain young people, gave a small gasp. Her spoon clattered against her plate, her hand rose briefly to her throat, and then, quite suddenly, she slumped forward in her chair. A collective cry went up. Mrs. Bantry dropped her napkin. The Colonel leapt to his feet. Mr. Grant shouted for brandy, but it was too late. Within moments, Mrs. Constance Deering was dead. Miss Marple, calm even amid the confusion, leaned forward and quietly examined the fallen woman. The face was grey, the lips tinged faintly blue. "I rather think," she said softly, "that Mrs. Deering has been poisoned." A hush fell across the room, the only sound the soft hiss of the fire. Outside, snow continued to fall, silently covering the footprints on the drive. The frost coach that had brought them had left an hour earlier. They were now stranded in the countryside. 8 people, one of them dead and another who must be a murderer. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in her lap and gazed around the table. Her eyes, mild yet penetrating, lingered on each face in turn. "How very unfortunate," she murmured. "But perhaps before too long we shall find that nothing about this day was left to chance." Colonel Halworth's booming voice, usually so full of authority, faltered as he called for calm. Please, everyone, remain seated. I'll telephone the police at once." But the ancient manor stood miles from the nearest village, and the snow, now falling in thick, silent sheets, had already buried the road. The telephone line crackled uselessly. The frost coach had gone, and there would be no passing motor for hours. Mrs. Bantry clutched her shawl. "Oh heavens, Jane, what are we to do?" Miss Marple, who had calmly requested that the housemaid fetch a blanket for the late Mrs. Deering, replied in her mild way, "For the moment, my dear, we are quite safe. Murderers, in my experience, do not act twice in haste." The Colonel, pale and shaken, poured himself a brandy. "Poison, you said, Miss Marple? Surely not." Miss Marple regarded the untouched dishes before her. Mrs. Deering's symptoms were rapid, the bluish tinge about the lips. "Yes, I think it was poison, Colonel. Something fast-acting, perhaps slipped into her glass, though whether she was the intended victim remains to be seen." A hush fell over the group. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the distance, a clock struck 3. Mr. Grant rose, blustering. "This is monstrous. I won't sit here like a criminal waiting for the constable. We must search the place, question the servants. Quite unnecessary." Miss Marple interrupted gently. "We have but to observe. Murder reveals itself, Mr. Grant, often in the smallest detail." The servants were dismissed to the kitchen while the guests gathered in the drawing-room. The body had been respectfully covered, though the knowledge of it lying just beyond the door lent the house a strange chill that no fire could dispel. Miss Marple settled herself near the hearth, her knitting needles clicking softly. "Now then," she began, her tone kind yet precise, "I think we must first establish what each of us observed during luncheon." Colonel Halworth went first, his voice strained. "She was in excellent spirits when she arrived. I hadn't seen Constance Deering in years. She was my late wife's cousin, you know. We'd exchanged some letters about financial matters. She'd hinted she might help me with a small loan to repair the estate. Nothing more. Miss Marple nodded, and before she collapsed, she said something about trusting certain young people. Does anyone know to whom she referred? All eyes shifted toward Dennis Halworth, who flushed crimson. She might have meant me, I suppose, he said uneasily. Aunt Constance never liked me much. She thought I spent too freely and kept unsuitable company, by which, murmured Mrs. Bantry under her breath, she means Miss Elwood, I expect. Clara Elwood, sitting stiffly, gave a small gasp. That's unfair. Mrs. Deering didn't approve of anyone, least of all me, but I swear I hardly spoke to her today. She wouldn't look at me. Miss Marple studied her closely. You were seated beside her, Miss Elwood. Did you notice her take her wine? Clara hesitated. She'd asked for a refill just before the soup was served. Dennis poured it for her. Then she tasted it, made a face, and said it was bitter. She pushed it aside, but when Colonel Halworth toasted us, she took another sip. Dennis straightened. She asked me to pour it. I only filled her glass from the same decanter we all drank from. Indeed, said Miss Marple softly, glancing at the decanter still on the sideboard. I imagine it will be of great interest when the police arrive. Mr. Edwin Fawcett, the quiet man with spectacles, cleared his throat nervously. If I might add, Mrs. Deering seemed agitated. Before luncheon she received a note from someone. I happened to see it handed to her by the butler. She read it, turned quite white, and tore it up. Did you see who sent it? Asked Miss Marple. No, ma'am, only that the handwriting was bold, almost theatrical. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. How very interesting. The conversation turned tense. Mr. Grant began muttering about wills and inheritances, and Mrs. Bantry, never one to resist speculation, whispered that Mrs. Deering had once invested in a dubious land scheme, possibly involving Mr. Grant himself. By 4:30, the snow showed no sign of easing. Tea was brought in, a ritual Miss Marple insisted upon, for she believed calm conversation often loosened tongues more effectively than interrogation. As the cups clinked, she observed the group with quiet precision. Colonel Halworth's hand trembled as he lifted his saucer. Miss Elwood, pale but steady, kept her eyes down. Dennis paced by the window, his expression clouded. "Forgive me," Miss Marple said suddenly, "but has anyone seen Mrs. Deering's handbag?" There was a pause. The maid, called in, confessed she'd last seen it beside the lady's chair. It was no longer there. Miss Marple folded her knitting and rose. Curious. Handbags, in my experience, are like secrets. When they go missing, something unpleasant is inside. After a short search, the handbag was found beneath the sideboard, half hidden by a curtain. Inside was the torn fragment of the note Mr. Fawcett had mentioned, just enough to read 2 words, "Tonight, alone." Miss Marple said nothing for a long moment. Then she looked up at Colonel Halworth, whose face had gone ashen. "Colonel," she said quietly, "I think it's time you told us what business truly brought Mrs. Deering to Windermere Lodge today. For if my suspicions are correct, her murder began long before this luncheon, and perhaps even before this journey on the frost coach." The Colonel swallowed hard, gripping the mantelpiece. "You're right, Miss Marple, there was another reason she came, but heaven help me, I never thought it would end like this." Miss Marple gave a slow, knowing nod. "Yes, murder seldom ends the way one intends, but I fancy before long we shall see precisely how it began." The wind howled faintly against the tall windows of Windermere Lodge as the snow thickened, swallowing the daylight into a pale blue-grey dusk. The guests huddled near the fire while Miss Marple, serene and sharp-eyed, regarded the Colonel over her spectacles. "Perhaps, Colonel Halworth," she began softly, "you will tell us the truth now, before the truth reveals itself without your assistance." The old soldier sighed deeply, his shoulders sagging beneath invisible weight. "Very well, Mrs. Deering and I were not merely cousins by marriage. Years ago, before I wed my dear Elena, Constance and I were close. It ended badly. She was proud, ambitious, and I was foolish, but she never forgave me, not entirely." He paused, staring into the fire. "Recently I wrote to her. The estate is failing. I asked her for a loan. She agreed on one condition." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "And what was that condition?" "That I dismiss my nephew, Dennis, from the will." A collective murmur swept the room. Dennis sprang to his feet. "That's a lie. She wanted me ruined because I refused her advances. She tried to manipulate me, Aunt Jane, just like everyone else she couldn't control." Mrs. Bantry gasped. "Advances? Mercy, what a dreadful woman!" But Miss Marple, her face unreadable, merely said, "That is quite an accusation, Mr. Halworth. Are you suggesting that Mrs. Deering was infatuated with you?" Dennis's jaw tightened. "She sent me letters, threatened to expose debts I owe, said she'd see me begging in the frost. I burnt them all." Miss Elwood, who had been silent until now, spoke tremulously. "He's telling the truth. I saw one of the letters. It was cruel. She wanted to destroy him. Then perhaps," said Mr. Grant, swirling his sherry. He had more than enough motive to silence her permanently. "Dennis turned on him, and you didn't. Everyone knows you and Mrs. Deering were partners in that phony investment scheme last year. She was going to tell the papers." Mr. Grant's ruddy face blanched. "Absolute nonsense." Miss Marple's quiet voice cut through the rising tension. "Gentlemen, please, anger is the friend of guilt. It makes people say rather more than they ought." Her eyes turned toward the withdrawn Mr. Fawcett, who sat rigidly, clutching his book. "And what about you, Mr. Fawcett? You observed much and spoke little. You mentioned seeing a note. How curious, for someone who sat several seats away." He flushed. "I happened to glance up, that's all." She dropped it briefly. "I wasn't spying, Miss Marple." "No," said Miss Marple mildly, "but you are, if I am not mistaken, a man with some experience in ledgers. A clerk, perhaps." "Yes," he admitted, adjusting his spectacles. "I worked for Mr. Deering's company many years ago. I left after his death." "Under favourable terms?" Miss Marple asked. He hesitated. "Not exactly. Mrs. Deering accused me of mishandling accounts. I never forgave her humiliation, but I didn't poison her, if that's what you mean." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I rarely mean what people expect, Mr. Fawcett." The Colonel poured another brandy, his hand shaking. "Good Lord, this is turning into a witch hunt. Let's be sensible. There's no proof of anything. On the contrary," Miss Marple said gently, "proof is often hidden in plain sight." She turned to the maid. "My dear, you said earlier that Mrs. Deering complained her wine tasted bitter. Do you recall who poured from that decanter before the meal?" The maid frowned. "It were Mr. Grant, miss. He poured a glass for the Colonel, then one for Mrs. Deering, before setting it down." All eyes swivelled to the solicitor. Mr. Grant's jovial expression had vanished, replaced by rigid fury. "Are you accusing me, madam? I've practised law for 25 years with an untarnished record." Miss Marple regarded him steadily. "I accuse no one. I merely observe that opportunity often comes disguised as courtesy." "Rot," he barked. "You can't prove a thing." Miss Marple knitted quietly for a moment, then said, "Perhaps not yet, but there's one thing that troubles me. Mrs. Deering received a note before luncheon. Yes, the maid delivered it, but she could not have brought it from outside. The snow had already begun, which means the sender was someone inside this house." A silence settled over the room like frost. "Someone," she continued softly, who knew she would raid it alone, someone who wished to ensure she drank from her glass. Mrs. Bantry shivered. Jane, you make it sound so deliberate. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with quiet certainty. Murder almost always is. At that moment, a faint knock echoed from the hall. The butler, face pale, stepped in holding a silver tray. Miss Marple, ma'am, I found this under the library carpet. Upon the tray lay a small brown bottle, its label faded, but its meaning unmistakable. Prussic acid. Miss Marple murmured, how very old-fashioned. Mr. Grant sprang up. Anyone could have planted that. I won't sit here to be framed. He started toward the door, but Miss Marple's calm voice stopped him cold. Running away, Mr. Grant, seldom improves one's innocence, especially when one's fingerprints are likely all over the evidence. Grant froze, his face contorting between fear and fury. Then, to everyone's astonishment, Clara Elwood burst into tears. Please, please stop. You're all wrong. She wasn't supposed to die. Not really. The room went deathly still. Miss Marple's knitting slipped to her lap. My dear Miss Elwood, she said softly, perhaps you had better tell us what you mean by that. Clara buried her face in her hands. I only wanted to frighten her. She was cruel to Dennis, always threatening him. I swapped her glass with the one I'd put the tonic in just to make her sick. Not to kill her. Miss Marple's eyes grew grave. And where did you get this tonic, my dear? Clara sobbed. From Mr. Fawcett. He said it was harmless, just something to upset the stomach. He told me it would teach her a lesson. Every head turned to the pale, trembling clerk. He looked stricken, his lips forming words that never came. Miss Marple rose slowly, the truth dawning in her gaze. Ah, she said quietly, I begin to see now. The frost may have covered our tracks, but it cannot conceal intent. The storm outside raged on, sealing Windermere Lodge in silence once more. Inside, 8 uneasy souls waited, knowing that Miss Marple, in her calm, gentle way, was about to reveal which among them had turned deceit into death. The drawing-room of Windermere Lodge had grown oppressively still. The fire, once bright and crackling, now burned low, casting long, restless shadows across the faces of those gathered within. Clara Elwood sat weeping softly, her tear-streaked face buried in a handkerchief, while Mr. Fawcett stood pale and rigid, his eyes darting toward the small bottle of poison glinting dully on the tray. Miss Marple, still seated by the hearth, looked every bit the picture of gentility, her hands folded neatly, her expression composed. Yet behind those mild blue eyes her mind worked swiftly, fitting each piece of the puzzle together with delicate precision. My dear Miss Elwood, she began gently, you say that Mr. Fawcett provided you with this tonic. Might I ask under what pretense? Clara sniffled miserably. He told me it was a harmless remedy, a bit of laudanum and herbs, to make her ill for a few hours, just to frighten her. I never imagined it could be poison. He said it would teach her not to meddle in other people's affairs. All eyes fixed upon Fawcett. He swallowed hard. That's not true, he stammered. I may have said something of the sort, but I never gave her poison. I'd no reason to kill Mrs. Deering. Miss Marple's voice remained quiet but firm. Oh, I think you had every reason, Mr. Fawcett. You were dismissed from her husband's firm years ago under suspicion of embezzlement, a matter you've long denied, I'm sure. But she apparently kept the evidence. I imagine that evidence was in the letter she received this morning. Fawcett's lips parted, but no sound emerged. She might have written to you. Miss Marple continued softly, promising to expose your past unless you assisted her with her current schemes. A desperate woman might demand such help. A desperate man, in turn, might see an opportunity to silence her. Mr. Grant gave a low whistle. Good heavens, Miss Marple, you should have been a barrister. But Miss Marple shook her head. Oh no, Mr. Grant, barristers look for proof. I look for truth. She rose slowly, her voice carrying an authority that seemed to fill the room. Let us consider what we know. Mrs. Deering received a note, written in bold, theatrical script shortly before luncheon. She read it, turned pale, and tore it up. The fragments we recovered bore the words "tonight, alone." It was not a love note, as some might assume, but a summons. The Colonel frowned. A summons? From whom? From the person she intended to blackmail. Miss Marple said quietly she meant to meet that person here, after the meal, to extract what she wanted. She did not live long enough to do so. She paused, letting the silence stretch, her gaze drifting to the frosted windows. Now let us recall that Mrs. Deering's wine tasted bitter even before she drank from it. That means the poison was in the decanter, not merely in her glass, which means anyone who poured could have been the intended victim or the intended instrument. Dennis leaned forward, alarmed. Then I might have been poisoned too. Miss Marple gave a small, knowing smile. No, Mr. Halworth, the decanter contained only a small measure of poison, just enough to taint a single glass. It was introduced during the luncheon service, when all eyes were upon the soup. I dare say the culprit counted upon confusion and conversation to conceal the act. Her eyes flicked briefly toward the sideboard, and that culprit, I believe, is the only person who had both motive and opportunity to ensure that Mrs. Deering, and only Mrs. Deering, drank from that glass. Mr. Grant shifted uneasily. You can't mean— Oh, but I do, Miss Marple interrupted softly. You, Mr. Grant. A gasp rippled through the room. The solicitor's face turned a ghastly shade of white. That's absurd, he blustered. Utterly absurd. Why would I risk my reputation, my life, because Mrs. Deering was about to expose your fraudulent investment scheme? Miss Marple said crisply. You misappropriated her funds under false pretense. She had letters you wrote, which she intended to show the Colonel today. You knew she would bring them. You travelled on the same coach, ensuring proximity, and at luncheon you poured the wine, masking your intent beneath your bluff charm. Unfortunately for you, the bitterness in the glass betrayed your haste. Mr. Grant's bluster faltered. You've no proof. On the contrary, said Miss Marple, I have quite enough. When you poured that wine, you used a handkerchief to polish the decanter's neck, did you not? An unnecessary gesture, since it had already been cleaned by the maid. You claimed it was habit, but I dare say the police will find traces of prussic acid upon that same handkerchief, should it still be in your pocket. The solicitor's hand moved instinctively toward his coat. A dreadful pause followed, broken only by the crackle of the dying fire. Miss Marple's eyes were kind but unyielding. You see, Mr. Grant, guilt rarely hides where habit lives. You gave yourself away long before the first glass was poured. Colonel Halworth stepped forward, his face grim. You damned scoundrel, he muttered. She may have been wicked, but she didn't deserve that. Mr. Grant sank into a chair, his face slack with defeat. It wasn't supposed to happen like that, he whispered. She was going to ruin me. I meant only to frighten her, to make her ill. I didn't realize how little it would take. Miss Marple sighed softly. Murder seldom requires much, Mr. Grant. Only motive, opportunity, and the smallest lapse in conscience. She turned toward Clara, who still trembled in her seat. And as for you, my dear, your guilt lies only in foolishness. Let this be a lesson. When one conspires to do harm, even from love, one becomes a thread in a darker tapestry than one ever imagined. Outside, the storm had begun to ease. Through the frosted windows, the faint glimmer of moonlight touched the snowbound lawns. The frost coach, long gone, would not return until morning, for now justice and the truth waited within Windermere Lodge. Miss Marple sank back into her chair, taking up her knitting once more. I think, she said quietly, We may all do with a cup of tea before the authorities arrive. There is nothing so restorative after murder as tea properly brewed. The following morning dawned clear and still. The storm had passed, leaving the grounds of Windermere Lodge wrapped in pristine snow, untouched, except for the faint tracks of the frost coach returning from the village with Inspector Craddock of the county police. The air was crisp, cold, and utterly silent, as though the very earth held its breath after the dreadful business of the night before. Inside the drawing-room a small fire glowed once again. The guests sat subdued, their faces weary, their nerves frayed. Only Miss Marple, calm and composed, sipped her tea as though she had not spent the night in the presence of a murderer. Inspector Craddock, hat in hand, gave her a respectful nod. "Morning, Miss Marple. I might have known you'd be in the thick of it. I've heard the outline from Colonel Halworth, but perhaps you'd be so good as to take me through it yourself." Miss Marple smiled mildly. "Of course, Inspector. It's all quite simple, really, though I dare say it didn't look that way at first." The others listened in uneasy silence as Miss Marple began to speak, her gentle voice threading through the quiet room like the soft ticking of a clock. "Mrs. Deering," she said, was a woman accustomed to control. She'd spent her life manipulating others, financially, emotionally, and otherwise. When such a person reaches a certain age, resentment tends to accumulate around them like frost on a window pane. In this case, resentment came from many directions. She glanced at Dennis and Clara, who sat side by side, subdued but united. Young Mr. Halworth was her favourite target of late. She held his debts, taunted him with them, and made quite sure his engagement to Miss Elwood was doomed from the start. She had, I believe, threatened to expose him to his uncle unless he broke it off. Clara's eyes filled with tears. She said she'd ruin him. I couldn't bear it. "Yes," said Miss Marple kindly. And so, when Mr. Fawcett, a man who also had reason to despise Mrs. Deering, whispered that a harmless tonic might teach her humility, you believed him. You meant no lasting harm, my dear, but poison is seldom harmless. Fortunately for you, Mr. Fawcett's part in this was limited to deception. He never gave you poison, only laudanum. It was Mr. Grant who introduced the fatal element. Inspector Craddock nodded. "You're sure of that, ma'am?" "Quite sure," Miss Marple replied. Mr. Grant was already in serious trouble. Mrs. Deering had uncovered proof that he'd swindled her and others in a fraudulent investment scheme. She threatened exposure, not in words, but in the very tone of her conversation during the coach journey. He poured her wine at luncheon, pretending joviality, but his every action betrayed anxiety. The poison, a trace of prussic acid, was hidden in his ring, the sort with a small hinged compartment, old-fashioned but practical for someone who dabbles in deceit. Mr. Grant, seated under watch at the far end of the room, let out a bitter laugh. "You've quite the imagination, madame." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Not imagination, Mr. Grant, observation. You see, when Mrs. Deering collapsed, you reached for your napkin with your right hand, though you'd worn your signet ring on the left throughout the meal. And when I later observed you polishing the decanter's neck, you used that same right hand. I believe when the police examine your ring, they will find traces of prussic acid within it." Inspector Craddock nodded to his constable, who retrieved the ring from Grant's pocket. A few moments later, the inspector's grim expression confirmed Miss Marple's quiet certainty. "Well, that settles that," Craddock said gravely. "You've done it again, Miss Marple." Grant sagged in his chair, defeated. "She'd have destroyed me. I only wanted to frighten her. She shouldn't have drunk so much. She wasn't even the intended victim, not truly." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Perhaps not, but murder seldom allows such careful boundaries, Mr. Grant. Evil is like frost, it spreads further than one means it to. There was silence for a long while. The snow outside glittered in the morning sun, a deceptive beauty masking the tragedy it had witnessed. Colonel Halworth cleared his throat, his voice husky. "Miss Marple, I don't know how to thank you. You've saved my family, and perhaps my soul. I dread to think what might have happened if this had gone unsolved." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Oh, I think it would have come out eventually, Colonel. Truth, you know, is a rather persistent thing, like a weed in one's garden. It has a way of finding daylight." Mrs. Bantry, who had spent most of the night nursing her nerves with strong tea, leaned toward her friend. "Really, Jane, you make it sound almost simple." Miss Marple gave a soft chuckle. "Most human misdeeds are simple, my dear. Vanity, greed, jealousy. Those are the weeds that grow most quickly. The difficulty lies in recognizing them before they choke out everything else." By afternoon the police had taken Mr. Grant away, and the frost coach, its windows frosted with a thin crust of ice, was ready to return the remaining guests to St. Mary Mead. The world outside sparkled under a pale winter sun, so calm and lovely that it seemed impossible such horror had unfolded within it. As the coach rumbled down the lane, Mrs. Bantry turned to Miss Marple with a sigh. "You do make one dreadfully afraid of people, Jane. One never knows what anyone's capable of, even over a simple luncheon." Miss Marple smiled, gazing out at the gleaming frost fields. "Oh, I shouldn't say that, my dear. People are much the same everywhere, capable of wickedness, yes, but also of kindness. One simply has to observe carefully and remember that both lie very near the surface." Mrs. Bantry gave a small, tired laugh. "You make it sound almost comforting." "It is," said Miss Marple gently, "because when one knows what to look for, one is seldom taken by surprise." The frost coach rolled on through the glittering countryside, leaving behind Windermere Lodge and the memory of murder. Inside, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles clicking softly in rhythm with the turning wheels. The frost, bright and cold, stretched endlessly ahead, beautiful, silent, and at last undisturbed.